disciples are returning to Jerusalem. Jesus rode into the city on the back of a donkey. The townspeople greeted him like a king. They laid their coats down in front of him for the donkey to walk on. Others waved palm branches in celebration.
Look, do you see him? It is the Messiah. He has come to free the Jews from oppression. Let us welcome him and shout, Hosanna to the Son of David.
Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who names the name of the Lord. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
Hosanna to the King of David.
Hosanna in the highest, you are king.
But not everybody was celebrating. The chief priests and other religious leaders became upset. This did not fit with their religious practices. They plotted against Jesus. They wanted this man who called himself to be the Son of God to be killed. Now, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, it was time of Passover. Passover is a Jewish holiday during which the people thanked God for sparing them from death in Egypt many years earlier. Jesus and his disciples gathered in an upstairs room to have their own Passover meal. Jesus was breaking bread for his disciples when he said,
I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me.
No,
Surely not I, Lord.
One of you who has shared this meal with me.
Surely not I, Lord.
Yes, Judas, it is you.
Jesus knew that Judas had accepted money from the religious leaders. How it must have pained Jesus to have someone whom he treated as a close friend betray him. Jesus and his disciples headed to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus had a very heavy heart. He knew that in a few short days the world would turn on him and nail him to a cross. Even his disciples would turn against him. Jesus said to them,
Tonight, you will all abandon me.
No, Lord, I will die for you.
Peter, you will deny knowing me 3 times before the rooster crows.
When they reached the garden, Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to help him by praying for him.
My soul is crushed by sorrow to the point of death. Please support me by staying awake.
Jesus left his disciples there and went off by himself to plead with his Father. He fell to the ground.
Father, Father, everything is possible with you. Please, Father, must I bear this? Take this cup away from me. Yet I want your will, not mine.
As Jesus cried out to God, the disciples too prayed. But much had happened that day, and they soon became drowsy. When Jesus returned to them, he found Peter, James, and John fast asleep.
Asleep? How could you sleep? You couldn't wait 1 hour? I'm going to go and pray. Please, stay awake.
Jesus did not wait for their reply. His sorrow was too great to listen to their excuses. While Peter, James, and John looked at each other in shame, Jesus continued his prayer with God. He prayed a very long time. There was much he wanted to bring to God. The disciples, on the other hand, had no idea what was to happen to Jesus. They couldn't understand what he was so upset about. Wasn't he the king of the Jews? Who could hurt Jesus? A man with the power to heal diseases, control the wind and waves, and cast out demons? They soon grew tired of praying. By the time Jesus returned, they were fast asleep.
How could you sleep when I am such sorrow? Please, stay awake.
After Jesus said this, he again went to be by himself. He again fell to his knees. It says in the Bible that while he prayed, his sweat was like drops of blood. Jesus' sorrow was that great. And yet the disciples, even after Jesus had rebuked them twice for falling asleep, dozed off again. But Jesus did not plead with them this time. It was too late.
Wake up. I must go. My betrayer is here.
Suddenly, Judas appeared with the soldiers.
The one that I kissed is you.
Once Judas showed the soldiers which one was Jesus, they ran up and seized him. The disciples fled in fear, deserting Jesus just like they said they would. At this time, the Jews were ruled by the Roman Empire. Pontius Pilate was a Roman who was in charge of the Jews. He was the one who made all of the big decisions. Therefore, Jesus was brought to his palace. This was where the trial to determine whether Jesus would be crucified was to take place. Peter had followed the soldiers from a distance. When Jesus was brought into the palace, Peter stayed outside by the fire. He was still very afraid.
Hey, aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?
No, I am not.
That man we just arrested. Didn't I see you with him in the garden?
No, that wasn't me. I remember you from when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. That was you, wasn't it? No, I tell you, I don't even know a man named Jesus.
At that moment, a rooster crowed. Peter, realizing that he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times, even after he had said that he would die for him, ran off in tears. Meanwhile, inside the palace of Pilate, Jesus was brought in for questioning.
Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your idea of me? Or did others talk about me?
What are you asking me for? Am I a Jew? It was your people and your chief priests that handed you over to me. What have you done?
My kingdom is not of this place. For if it was, my people would stay to fight to prevent my arrest. Therefore, my kingdom is of another place.
You're a king then.
You're right in saying I'm a king. For that reason, I was born. Test by the truth. Everyone on this side of the truth listens to me.
After hearing Jesus say this, Pilate turned to the crowd and said,
I find no basis for a charge against this man. It seems to me he has done nothing deserving of being crucified. However, it is your custom for me to release one prisoner at this time of Passover. Would you like for me to release the king of the Jews?
No, give us Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!
Now Barabbas was a murderer, a terribly violent man, but he was released. Pilate then thought that if he allowed Jesus to be beaten, the Jews would be satisfied. The soldiers beat Jesus. They made a crown out of thorns and placed it on his head. And they gave him a purple robe, the color that kings wore, and mocked him, saying,
All hail, the great King of the Jews!
With Jesus beaten and bleeding, Pilate showed him to the crowd. Hoping that they'd be satisfied, he said,
Look, I'm bringing him out here so I show you that he has done nothing deserving being crucified.
When the crowd saw him, they shouted,
Crucify him! Crucify him!
You crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against this man.
We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claims to be the Son of God.
When Pilate heard this, he was frightened. He did not want to have all of the Jews rebel against him because of this one man, Jesus. He asked Jesus,
Where do you come from?
but Jesus did not answer.
Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not understand I have the power to crucify you or free you?
You would have no power over me when it was given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greatest sin.
From then on, Pilate did all he could to set Jesus free, but it could not be done. The crowd would only shout,
Crucify him! Crucify him! Take him away!
So Jesus was stripped and forced to carry his own cross. He was led out to the place of the skull in order to be crucified. Jesus hung in pain until he cried out.
It is finished.
Because it was still Passover, the religious leaders did not want to see Jesus' body still hanging on the cross while they attempted their ceremonies. So the soldiers went to hurry up Jesus' death by breaking his legs. Since Jesus' body hung limply, they pierced his side with a knife. A mixture of blood and water poured out. This proved that Jesus, God's only Son, was surely dead. They took him down and laid him in the grave. Now if the story ended here, it would surely be a tragedy. The man who was without sin is killed by the people he loved and lived to serve. Jesus' life would seem a meaningless one, but it wasn't meaningless. He was a human being, so he could take on our sin for us, so that he could take on the punishment that we deserve. And yet, he was also God, so he could overcome that sin, so that the punishment would not destroy him. Because, you see, Jesus rose from the grave. We call this resurrection. And now, because he conquered sin, we can be free of our sin if we ask Jesus to forgive us. That's how much Jesus loves you. Hopefully, you've seen how important this all is. Hopefully, you and your cabin will take this chance to talk about Jesus and what he did for each one of us.